Hello, thank you for that introduction, Father. I actually would like to start on that note. So in my previous life, I spent 10 years. I'm a graduate of the University of Chicago, so it's good to be back on the north side. I was a visitor to the north side. I was a resident of the south side, so it's a really beautiful place you all have up here. So 7 years in Chicago at the University of Chicago, and then I got my first job at a Catholic university, Catholic identifying university in Southern California, and spent 10 years as an academic. And one of the reasons this is such a treat for me is that I get to be among people who really can make a massive evangelical impact. In the world of academics, you know, we would all spend literally months polishing our ideas and then go to a conference and maybe present to sometimes fewer than 10 people in the room, and then walk back out into irrelevance and obscurity until the next conference, taking our complimentary bottle of water on the way. And so, you know, we would have great passion for what we were doing as Catholic academics, many of us, but the reality is our ideas oftentimes, which are just the ideas in their best form of the Catholic intellectual tradition, not our ideas, really wouldn't make an impact. But you all can make an impact. So I thank you for being here. And I thank you for your evangelical witness and the courage you will need to bring it out into the world. So I want to, in these brief introductory remarks, which I intend just to sort of set the table for the rest of the discussion with the panel, persuade you of two things. One is that diversity, equity, and inclusion are hopelessly corrupt concepts that are irreducibly at odds with the basic tenets of justice in the natural law tradition. So not just Catholicism understood as a revealed tradition, but they violate human dignity and the most basic understanding of what it means to be in just relationship with each other. The flip side is that, all right, I'm done, all right. That was easy. I'm taking my bottle of water, I'm out of here. The flip side of that is I want to also persuade you that dignity, equality, and solidarity does everything that diversity, equity, inclusion putatively says that it wants to do. And charitably, I'll say that that ideology does have good intentions, although I think that's not necessarily the case. But the point is we don't need it as Catholics. We don't need it as rational beings. We don't need it as those who adhere to the natural law tradition. And the final introductory point is, when I'm talking about dignity, equality, and solidarity, again, these are not my ideas. These are like if you walk into the warehouse of Catholic social thought, it's the display case right at the beginning, right? You just get your dignity, your equality, and your solidarity right as you walk in. I did not extract this from some kind of archive deep in the basement of the Vatican. So this is basic stuff. Unfortunately, it's been obscured because of the cultural movement that we're all enduring right now. So, how do we approach this controversial topic? What do the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion mean in a corporate, government, and educational context? What are the moral implications of those terms, and is there a better alternative? There is. So the first sort of conceptual point I want to make is that it's oftentimes described as diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? It's better understood in terms of the relationship of the ideas as diversity, inclusion, and equity, which gets a much more accurate acronym, DIE. I say that slightly with my tongue in my cheek, but it's actually the case, because diversity is the fundamental sort of moral fact of this ideology that inclusion then seeks to respond to, and then creates a community that is then governed by equity. We're also going to have to take an unhappy detour through a concept called intersectionality and understand how this is all put together. So what defines diversity? Diversity is defined as differences among humans that are, on the one hand, A, empirically observable, meaning you can see them, like race or age or biological sex or physical or, in some cases, mental disability, and some religions. So diversity that we can see. But it also includes diversity that has to be self-disclosed. I mean, you know, diversity we're only aware of if it's shared or made known to us. So that would be things like sexual attraction, country of origin, religions without external markers, gender identity, which is a false category. I have to mention it because it's part of the diversity, equity, inclusion ideology, but it doesn't correspond with reality, socioeconomic status, and things like that. So diversity is the fundamental moral fact that inclusion and equity respond to. Now, the first point to highlight here is that diversity is concerned with categories. So you may all think that you are individuals with an interesting, particular, personal narrative from where you started off to where you've come. You may think of yourself internally as a diverse individual with lots of experiences and lots of facets. According to this ideology, you represent a category. So you've already been reduced to not even a sociological category, but a moral sociological category, and you're no longer an individual. So then what defines inclusion? Inclusion is maximizing diversity within a community. Maximizing diversity within a community. But then the question comes up of, well, how do we know which kinds of diversities to include in the inclusive community? One of the great facts that I discovered while doing research for this talk is that green-eyed people are only 2% of the human population. So if you have green eyes, congratulations. But usually that's not part of the inclusion, that's not part of the diversity that's included into the community. So we know that diversity is concerned with group categories, but now we have to specify which group categories count for inclusion and which count for exclusion. So important point here, put it in bold. The condition for the possibility of an inclusive community is what? Exclusion. Exclusion makes the inclusive community possible. So in order to understand what kinds of inclusion get through into the diverse community, we have to pass through the concept of intersectionality, which is really inclusion's gatekeeper. And intersectionality is seeking to respond to sort of three sequential questions, three sequential problems. The first problem is that there's just too many different kinds of diversity. When we look around, and we do so without political categories already in mind, we can begin to divide up humanity into many different kinds of sets and subsets. And so if we're just relying on diversity, we're already going to have a problem of just too many to include. So the first solution to that problem, we would say, well, let's just focus on groups or categories that can be associated with past and or present discrimination and or inequality. This, however, leads to a second problem. These categories, once we've sort of sub-selected that groups that can be associated with present and or past discrimination or inequality, are internally diverse themselves, and also, especially in terms once you import sort of cultural values as well, may conflict with each other. This for me was sort of paradigmatically expressed in an institution where I used to teach, where they had a huge mural up, which was its purpose was to celebrate diversity, and it had representations of individuals, again, not real individuals, just individuals representing the category that had been imposed on them, of three different ideologies that are literally at war with each other, and it was under diversity. So the question is, well, what do we do now that we've got this subset of these other groups here that are actually at odds? So solution number two, you begin stacking and weighing intersecting identities or intersectional identities to identify subgroups within the subgroups that then get higher priorities. So for example, you put together an identity constituting race, sexuality, and gender identity. That, however, leads to problem number three. You do get, we're seeing it in real time, an uncontrolled proliferation of intersecting identities. And part of the issue there is that this whole ideology is sort of predicated on, the fancy word for this is called epistemology. It just means a system of knowing. The system of knowing at the heart of diversity, equity, inclusion is subjectivism, group subjectivism. Another way of putting it is emotivism. So basically, based on self-defined categories of knowledge, you can identify as belonging to a victim class, and from that begin stacking identities. And because it's based on lived experience, you've literally put yourself into a position where you cannot be contested. So this creates a general sort of formula where within these groups and among these groups, individuals can say, as a blank, 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 and blank, I feel or we feel unincluded, unsafe, unheard, etc., and therefore make a moral claim. So this creates warfare, either Cold War or hot war, because you have groups that are making claims on each other, each one of them appealing only to their own experiences. So this is where intersectionality delivers its final blow and says, you know what we need? We need you to unite the intersecting identities against a common enemy that represents a singular source of all oppression and, conveniently, who will be unable to resist. In other words, intersectionality needs a scapegoat. Scapegoat in the classical sense. So who would that scapegoat be? So I'm going to, as I got with some friendly people in the crowd, I'll take that. It's not always the case. So I'm going to quote to you. These are documents from they're produced by Vanderbilt University. So these are not obscure quotes. These are actually at the heart of this ideology, and you've probably already heard them in one way or another in your own companies, if you're not the boss of your own companies. Definitions of privilege and agents of oppression. So again, the question we're trying to answer here is, who is the common enemy? So here's the definition from Vanderbilt University. This has also been used by Smithsonian Museum. Privilege operates on a personal, interpersonal, cultural, and institutional levels and gives advantages, favors, and benefits to members of dominant groups at the expense of members of target groups. In the United States, privilege is granted to people who have membership in one or more of these social identity groups: white people, able-bodied people, heterosexuals, males, Christians, middle or owning class people, middle-aged people, and English-speaking people. Now, at the outset, you could say, okay, well, that's just a sociological definition. We're just identifying categories and then seeking to see how these categories operate in societies in terms of the distribution of resources or power or something like that. But then on top of that, you get a moral overlay or a prism on how to interpret these sociological categories, and that comes in the form of agents of oppression. Agents of oppression are members of the dominant social groups in the United States, privileged by birth or acquisition, which knowingly or unknowingly exploit, so you can be doing this without even knowing it, exploit and reap unfair advantage over members of groups that are targets of oppression. So when we combine the definition of privilege and the definition of oppression, we come up with a syllogism, or just a basic argument that explains all you need to know about diversity, equity, inclusion ideology, or DEI ideology. All oppression is caused by agents of oppression. Agents of oppression are those with the most privilege. White heterosexual Christian men have the most privilege. Therefore, white heterosexual Christian men are the cause of all oppression. So now we can go back and say, well, what defines inclusion? We now have an answer to that question. Maximizing diversity within a community. What kind of diversity? We're going to define it negatively. Non-white, non-male, non-Christian, non-heterosexual, non-middle-aged people. I don't know how the middle-aged people got in there. Non-English speaking people. All right, so diversity, the only diversity that counts are categories that are in those don't fill one of those check marks. Now, someone could say, well, I'm not white, or I'm not male. Well, again, what matters here is that all of these characteristics, so it's creating that hierarchy of value where the more of these negative characteristics you have, the lower you are in terms of moral regard. So note here that the individuals who are excluded because of this filter that's been imposed are excluded only because of their race, sex, age, religion, and country of birth, not because of their actions or behaviors. In other words, intersectionality plus diversity and inclusion is nothing less than neo-bigotry. Equity then, so now that defines the category of the community. So those are the people who get in according to the criteria of this category. So then the question is, well, how is that category governed? Equity is the answer to that. So equity is the distribution of goods, including resources, so income, salaries, and power, management positions, and higher up positions or lower positions, according to group identity. The criterion of fairness here, so who gets what, is only based upon membership in a group identity according to that hierarchy of intersectionality. And the method of imposing that is distribution, taking from one to give to another only because of membership in an identity group. So how do we morally assess this? Then I'll move on to the Catholic alternative. Whatever its intentions, DIE or DEI is unjust and should be abolished from all organizational governance, especially in Catholic institutions, period. It violates human dignity and the basic tenets of justice by punishing individuals for circumstances for which they are not responsible. It is paradigmatically racist and bigoted. Anti-racism is just a form of racism. It is based on a subjective epistemology that is indistinguishable from a bully's logic, meaning I want this, therefore you must do it or else, which eventually also causes the whole system to collapse. It assumes rather than demonstrates the causal connections to explain social inequality, and it doesn't even achieve its own purported goals in the workplace. So the better alternative is dignity, equality, and solidarity, which I will lay out very quickly. So the Catholic conception of dignity is based on the imago Dei, the image and likeness of God inhering in each one of us. Now that has two components. I'm going to give a very brief lesson here on theological anthropology. On the one hand, insofar as we're all made in the image and likeness of God, there's a permanence that is attached to each one of our individual existences. So we each have an individuated soul, but at a base level, that soul is the same. So it's individuated, it's ours, it is us, but it's the same in everyone. And we also have a body. So we're all uniquely, but also the same with regard to being a unity of body and soul. So our fundamental nature as a species is the same. Our bodies do differ, and they differ what's called ontologically, meaning male and female. Those are two separate categories that cannot be combined or otherwise made into the same thing. So there's a metaphysical difference there. And also an accidental characteristic. So our appearance, including our race, our hair color, our height, and those things. Now it's important to note here that physical diversity is a part of created nature. So diversity, again, using the fancy word here, ontologically, metaphysically, is good. It's intended. And so that'll be an important point to note. So that's the same in all of us, body and soul. What's different? Well, each one of our souls is also a potentiality to be realized. It's like a seed. So a seed, we all have the same seed, as it were, of dignity, but that seed has an end. It has a goal. It has a full flourishing. And so to the extent that we have the possibility of becoming fully who we are created to be as individuals, we have the chance of either attaining that goal or not. So that creates diversity that's going to respond to the category of human action. This potentiality in our souls and in our bodies as well grounds human freedom. The reason that we have freedom is because we are permanent as unity of body and souls, but also are free to choose and act in accordance with that existence or against it. It also establishes the good of the soul, which is virtue, and the good of the body, which is health. So how does this relate to equality, the next rung up? Here we have to make a distinction between equal respect and equal treatment. So because we are all fundamentally the same at that base natural level, unity of body and soul, everybody deserves and must be shown equal respect. And part of showing that equal respect is recognizing that the bodily diversity that exists among us is good. So we recognize it as a good in nature. However, beyond recognizing that it's good, that it's part of God's creative plan, it otherwise plays no role, zero role, our appearance, zero role in making moral judgments, either positive or negative. So at a baseline, we all treat each other with equal respect, no matter what. No matter our histories, no matter our appearances, no matter whether we like the person, dislike the person, equal respect, not equal treatment. So equal treatment is based on that potentiality of the imago Dei. So individuals are free to respond to their created nature as beings who are called to become the full flourishing representation of who they can be or not. And so we act in relationship to them with regards to the choices that we all individually make. Individuals are free to act differently in response to a uniform and objective standard. Now, putting this into a business context, we could say, well, what is that uniform and objective standard? Well, we could say good behavior, virtue, job performance, standardized test scores, or sales numbers, and the like. This justifies unequal treatment. So, what are three categories that we can use to justly discriminate specifically within the workplace or an organization. One is individual talent, which you could say that's the individual's capacity to outperform other individuals at fulfilling a specific task. Individual competence, the individual's capacity to perform the specific task well at a specific organization, what we oftentimes refer to as, is it a good fit? Is that person a good fit? And individual virtue, the individual's character considered independently of talent and competence, but still relevant to a company's culture and goals. So we all have equal dignity at a baseline, but that dignity also has a component that allows for human action, free human action, that we then respond to in the creation of communities, specifically in the context here, of individuals whom we all respect equally at a moral level, but we recognize their specific talents and virtues and bring those people specifically into our communities and then make the justification for different treatment based upon those criteria, which are equally applied to all. So the question is, well, what is solidarity? And I'll end on very briefly. Solidarity is actively seeking the objective good of all people, specifically those with whom you are in relation, with special attention to the materially and culturally impoverished. So it's important to highlight both here. Solidarity includes lack of resources, so those who are poor because they lack the physical necessity they need to operate at the basic level of society. But it also includes those, for example, who may have plenty of intellectual resources, but have never really had the opportunity to learn about God or to learn about what it really truly means to live a full, flourishing human life. So culturally impoverished, spiritually impoverished. Solidarity also includes a preferential option from the poor. And that's very important to highlight. That's a rock-solid principle in our tradition. So solidarity calls not only for not harming, it also calls for action. And you might pause here and say, well, haven't you just created a new identity group? So you're saying we can't use race, we can't use sexual differentiation, male and female, but you're saying we can use this thing called helping the poor? Isn't the poor just a new identity category, and you've just slipped in here a sort of a cheat to make this sound like it's different, but you just have a different preference for category? No. The reason is because need is universal. All of us are certainly not needy in the same way at the same time, but all of us are equally vulnerable to need. In fact, most of our life, at the very beginning of it and at the very end of it, we become dependent. We are dependent, we become dependent again. And so that's a shared category. That's called being vulnerable. It's called being human. And so we're responding to the needs that we see in others. We're responding to something that is shared among us all. I can't become a different race. I certainly cannot become a different sex, but I can become needy, and all of us can. And so we're addressing that specific part of what it means to be human universally when we're engaged in solidarity. So what does solidarity permit and encourage? It permits and encourages seeking the most qualified candidates in impoverished areas, funding educational training programs with the goal of producing qualified candidates in impoverished areas, targeting impoverished areas for internship opportunities, providing above and beyond benefits like generous parental leave policies, tuition assistance, flexible work at home policies for parents and things like that, and surpassing government requirements to create a workplace in which disabled persons will be able to perform as well as non-disabled persons, making accommodations. What does solidarity prohibit? Pedestaling certain racial or ethnic groups as more worthy of moral concern than others. Conversely, punishing non-favored racial and ethnic groups. Holding any individual responsible or guilty for anything other than his or her actions and behaviors. Violating the natural law, for example, by permitting men to enter women's bathrooms under the delusion that a man can actually be a woman while in that space. Subordinating the company's common good and the common good of society to caring for the poor by, for example, hiring individuals to help them out, but who are actually unqualified, which harms the common good of the organization and then the common good of society. And in sum, doing anything that violates the principles of dignity and equality. So in conclusion, diversity, inclusion, and equity produces workplace policies that are racist, sexist, heterophobic, religiously bigoted, natural law violating, and harmful to the organization's common good and, by extension, the common good of society, versus dignity, equality, and solidarity produces workplace policies that respect the inviolability of each person's personal dignity, treat each individual equally, while recognizing and rewarding her and his unique contributions, and call everyone to join together in solidarity to pursue the objective good of all, both inside and outside the organization, with special attention to the poor. So I ask you sincerely, which option sounds more like social justice? Thank you.